everyone in the waiting room here. There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us here on the last day of the New York State Craft Brewers Conference. It's been quite the week. It's been fun. Lots of great information. We'll just give everyone here just a few minutes to join before we get started. So it's 2:30. Is anybody drinking a beer this afternoon? Nice, Tony. Oh, great. Water, Jordan. Yeah, I'm still drinking water, but I'm thinking about getting a beer here soon.
Yeah, it's 11:30 here, but I could use a beer after this week.
It is Friday. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for joining us. I want to thank our sponsors for Friday. Cool Insurance Agency is Friday's presenting sponsor. And also want to thank our session sponsors, Omega Yeast, who we also have Erik Fowler from Omega Yeast presenting to us here today.
White Labs, little
I'm
awkward,
sorry.
but that's okay.
White Labs, I apologize, Erik. Big mistake there. But we do thank our session sponsors, Omega Yeast, Ontario Insurance Company, and Viatran Printing. And I put some links here in the chat. If you haven't claimed your free t-shirt yet from Viatran, there's a link there. You can click it and you can get a t-shirt branded with your logo on it. And we have Erik Fowler here from White Labs, who is going to talk to us today about yeast. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Erik and we can get started.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. I'm, like Chloe said, my name is Erik. I'm the Education and Brewery Experience Manager here at White Labs. A lot of what we'll be talking about in the next 45 minutes to an hour is applicable to any yeast supplier. So, you know, while I might use some of our strains as examples, just because it's what we have data on. So I give quite a bit of webinars and teach, you know, lectures like this, but I'm pretty stoked to see some videos on. So if you have questions and want to make it conversational, it's my Friday too, and that would be awesome. I'd rather talk, you know, with you for the next 45 minutes as opposed to at you. So if you want to ask questions, unmute yourself, feel free. I'll try to look at the chat as they come in too. But excuse me, White Labs is a primarily yeast provider, as everybody on this call probably knows. We've got facilities in San Diego, which is where I'm located today. If I turned off this virtual background, you look out the window and see 72 degrees and sunny. So you'll be a little jealous there. Asheville, North Carolina, we've got a production facility we've had for the last couple of years. I see Jordan live sitting somewhere at a brewery or something there. It's definitely not at work. And then Copenhagen, Denmark as well. So just some perspective about who we are. You know, I think it was 60% of breweries that placed at JBF last year worked with us and were our partners in the previous year in some capacity. So, you know, we definitely permeate the industry, whether it's through yeast, analytical services, education. We like to be kind of a one-stop shop for everybody's fermentation needs. And if anybody's not a beer brewer and has any specific questions to the beverage they produce too, just stop me. But a lot of this is applicable across the board. So we're going to be talking about blending yeast and just the process of working with a new yeast strain, whether it's a yeast blend or a single strain in a culture as well. When we're talking about traditional cultures, you know, most of this conversation is going to revolve around brewer's yeast, ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. There's not a whole lot of blending being done with lager strains, although conceptually, a lot of this information could work with lagers as well. We're talking about a single organism, right? We as a society and an industry have we've put a lot of effort into pure yeast, right? We want to know the organism that we're working with. We generally want to work with one organism. Historically, you know, most beers utilize multiple organisms because we weren't very sterile in our process. And so traditionally, we're talking about the last 100 and 140 years of working with a single strain. This allows us to have control and consistency when you're minimizing the ingredients you're working with, minimizing the living ingredients, right? It gives us a lot more control and predictability utilizing that. With that said, utilizing multiple organisms has its benefits, which we'll get to shortly. But when we're talking about control and consistency, temperature preference, most ale strains are in the same range of preference, let's say 66 to 70 Fahrenheit. But when you're working with multiple organisms, they might vary in preference by just a couple degrees. And those couple degrees might have beneficial or adverse effects on that yeast. So understanding what those temperature ranges are and preferences are very important. But working with one organism, it gives us a lot of control, right? We know this strain produces an awesome beer at 64 degrees, and we know the timeline and we know the consistency and can replicate that. We know its nutrient needs when we're working with one strain, right? And then metabolite production, which I tend to think is the most important. One way that White Labs was described was a flavor company. Somebody came up not knowing anything about beverages or what we do. Said, who is White Labs? We said, we're a flavor company because the products that we're working with and the strains that we're putting on the market we're looking at consistency and usability, but we're also really looking at how does this affect the final product. There are easier ways to use brewer's yeast, right? There are easier ways to cut corners in a process, but we're always looking at trying to provide the culture that's best suited to produce the best product. And when we say best product, it usually means flavor. That's why I think a lot of us have a tough time with hard seltzer because it kind of goes against the grain of what we've been taught for so long in making flavorful products. Not that seltzers can't be flavorful, but we generally don't want yeast influence in them. Some of the benefits of co-pitching, a unique flavor profile, alcohol tolerance, and attenuation, and tradition of using a mixed culture. So unique flavor profile, I've seen this quite a bit with different breweries in the market where, there's definitive strains for certain styles. And we all know that, right? If we're going to say a hazy beer, and I've got a case study in a little bit about that too. But if we say a hazy beer, we're all generally going to say London Fog, London 3, and essentially variations of the same or similar strains. But a lot of times when the market begins to get flooded with similar products, you want to begin to differentiate it. You want it to taste a little bit different than everybody else's. You're not trying to replicate the beer that founded the style. You're trying to create something new of your own. So just like you might change a hop bill or your grist, looking at different ways to manipulate your yeast or work with different cultures or incorporate different organisms to create unique flavors that are within style, but still unique and provide differentiation. Attenuation. So when I mention attenuation, I'm more so talking about working with unique strains that might have difficulty. They might produce great flavors, but not necessarily be suitable for the medium in which you're using it in. So, there's a lot of awesome strains. There's a lot of historic strains say that are found in the wild or on fruit that might be some form of Saccharomyces, but they might not be either super alcohol tolerant or be able to ferment maltose to a high degree, or maltotriose too, meaning it's going to stall out, right? And so often you might want to utilize a second organism that, your primary organism you're using for fermentation is producing a lot of your flavor, but your secondary organism helps finish the beer out, helps, make it so it's drinkable. You don't want a 50% attenuated beer, even if those initial, that flavor production from the yeast is beneficial. An example of that would be our Marion cacao strain that we released a couple years ago. It's an awesome strain that was used to ferment cacao nibs or beans into nibs. And then Like Saison 1 would be another one that I hear about quite a bit, of a strain that, is a slow fermenter after 50% attenuation. So maybe utilizing something like 001 or a Cal Ale type strain. And, lastly, the tradition of it. So you're looking at this list, examples of mixed culture beer styles or styles that are defined by mixed cultures. You're looking at a lot of historic styles, right? So the first brewery I worked at was a historic themed brewery, and we brewed an English brown porter. Well, most porters, most English beers in the 17 and 1800s underwent a secondary fermentation from Brettanomyces. So this beer, we tried to utilize enough brown malt to recreate that historic grist, and did a secondary fermentation with Brettanomyces. And what that did was dried the beer out, added some smoky phenolic character, and made a pretty interesting sessionable Brett beer. What sucked was selling it because while it was a cool beer, it was very difficult to communicate, and it wasn't something consumers were very adept to. So, for instance, we couldn't really approach an account and say, we have this brown porter that's awesome, go ahead and give it a try, because they're going to say, why is it phenolic? Why is it so dry? It's kind of smoky. It doesn't really fit that style, but it didn't have enough Brett character to label it as strictly a Brett beer either. So what we've seen, though, is more creativity of using like strains. So maybe finding two strains, that would be okay with a brown porter, two different types of English strains, or an American strain and English strain, mixing those and trying to coax some character out of it that way, that the consumer still preferred, but was still a little more historically accurate and fit with the beers we were trying to make. You have your more spontaneous fermented beers, which I'm not going to talk about too much in this talk because I think that could warrant a lecture of its own. But those are very traditionally mixed culture beers, right? A lot of people trying to recreate those spontaneous fermentations are still using 3 to 6 to 10 different organisms. But when you look at the fermentation of a spontaneous fermented beer, you're talking about over 100 organisms often. And a lot of times the timeline is so drastic and so long for those because they're using so many organisms. There's different times of out competition. There's different times where the nutrients might be preferred by one organism and not the other. pH plays a big factor. Alcohol plays a big factor. So there's a lot that goes into that. And then Berliner Weiss, we're talking about Saccharomyces, Lactobacillus, and Brettanomyces. And then farmhouse beers, which is a little more in line with what we're talking about today, would be just a Saccharomyces and Brettanomyces beer. So we need to understand what strains we're working with, right? There's a lot of trial and error that goes on with working with two like strains, but it's important to know that not all strains are equal. Just because you get certain character out of one strain in a certain beer and another strain in another beer doesn't mean you can't mix those strains and exactly get 50% of each, right? The growth pattern of those strains, the amount of O2 they might want, the gravity they're being used in, and as I said, most importantly, the temperature they're being used in, will all affect metabolite production of those two strains, and it will vary quite a bit in the production of that, and the strains trying to outcompete each other and what becomes dominant. We produce a beer, we've got a brewery on site here called Frankenstout, and it's 96 yeast strains. So we did full genome sequencing of a lot of our strains probably 6-7 years ago at this point. And there's 96 wells when they're looking at those strains. So we were able to create a single plate of all 96 strains, propagate it up from that, and brew this beer. And it's a big imperial stout. And with 96 strains on a plate, after going through many rounds of propagation, going into a couple 100-liter vessel at the end of it, do we think that all 96 strains are going to be at equal proportions? Yeah, not at all. But even if they were, does it mean that all 96, when put in the beer, are going to produce the metabolite production for the flavors we're looking for are going to be consistent? Again, not at all. So this beer, for the good first half dozen batches we brewed it, which we don't brew it very often, it was extremely Belgian forward, because the levels that they're producing, those esters and phenolic compounds from those Belgian strains, are so much higher and dominate any subtleties from these other strains. So what we ended up doing is taking that culture of 96 strains and cutting that half with cal ale. And that 001 was able to mute some of that flavor production of the other 96 strains and kind of round the beer a little bit more, so it was more palatable, and it just wasn't intense phenols in a big Belgian imperial stout. Yeast contribute more than 500 flavor and aroma compounds to finished beer, so again, there's a lot at play here. What's most important, I see people get really hung up on the types of metabolites certain strains produce, looking at the specific chemicals, looking at thresholds, looking at how to manipulate it to get exactly what they want. I am most concerned with what our panel perceives and what the consumers perceive, because you can look at analytical data, and we run all of our beers through our labs, so we get a lot more information than we need. But when it comes to being able to look at some of that, you can't always tell how it's going to taste without trying it. You might find a specific, say, isoamyl acetate, you might see like 1.5 ppm, which is above threshold. But you might try the beer and not get that at all, because there's such a matrix and so many other things going on. So it's important to correlate what your panel's tasting with the lab, but more important, what does the beer taste like, and how can we recreate that? So let's talk about the considerations that you really want to look at. Working with strains that fit a desired criteria, so accurate to style. Again, you're not going to be looking at throwing a Belgian strain in your hazy beer, right? You're going to look at, okay, we know English strains do well. We know some American strains probably do well. Let's take that into consideration and try to follow the guidelines, unless we're crazy and want to create a new style and a new beer. Reliable growth and fermentation. So aside from flavor, we want to look at consistency. Can I recreate this? Is this culture going to be something that I'm reharvesting and using in other beers, or can I only use it in this brand? Because that's something you want to consider before bringing in a new ingredient and adding a new process, right? You don't want to have to buy, as much as Jordan probably disagrees with me, you don't want to have to buy a fresh new pitch every time you rebrew that beer. You want to be able to manage that culture in-house for a couple generations and possibly use it for different brands. That's what you want to consider, because the growth of those organisms is going to be different, which I'll get to at the end of this talk. You want to make sure it's suitable for wort medium and conditions. Again, pH, sugar, nutrients, temperature, something to consider if your mixed culture includes bacteria. How is that low pH going to affect the ability for any of my brewer strains to perform? High attenuation, again, this is really relative. Most strains that are on the market are suitable for wort, for beer. And, high attenuation, we're talking about 60, 65% up. And then desired flocculation. So something to consider, especially if you're looking at harvesting. If you have a really low flocculent strain and a really high flocculent strain, that slurry and that pack is going to be very inconsistent when you harvest, right? So you want to look at the quality and quantity of your pitching yeast. So an example here would be, let's say our standard ale target pitch rate is between 0.5 and 1 million cells per mil per degree Plato. Obviously, there's some give and take on that one, but as an example, you could use, again, if you're brewing a Belgian Saison, and Saison 1 ale yeast is generally a slower fermenter, you may be able to throw 25% of 001, which really won't affect flavor too much, being such a neutral strain. Another thing you could look at is doing a staggered addition. So you could take that 565 Saison 1, use that as your primary inoculant, and then after the first 48 hours or 50% of attenuation, add your 001 during active fermentation. And that's looking at most flavor production being done during the growth phase of your culture, and that initial first 24 to 48 hours of your fermentation. So it allows you to have the characteristics of cal ale, where it's got that, ability to ferment fairly quickly and clean without worrying as much about flavor impact. And here's just an example of how temperature really affects it, and understanding the, if you're working with two different yeast strains, how temperature might affect that. Because manipulating temperature, this definitely applies for working with a single strain as well. But if you're outside of that Goldilocks zone, it can impact your beer pretty drastically. So looking at 75 to 66%, or sorry, 75 to 66 degrees Fahrenheit, most of it's fairly in line, but acetaldehyde's a lot higher and way above threshold for the 75, which is not super surprising. When you're looking at temperature, generally think the higher temperature, the more flavor. Again, this is not apples to apples. This is very strain dependent, but as a rule of thumb, if you want a cleaner beer, ferment cooler, right? Although lagers are working with different organisms, Saccharomyces pastorianus, the cooler temperatures really slow down and mute a lot of that ester production. So your lagers tend to be a lot cleaner, right? So being able to get ale strains at the lower range of their tolerance is going to produce a cleaner beer. But you want to know which organism prefers which temperature, and that might manipulate flavor quite a bit. So most importantly, define a target. So know what you want to brew. Sometimes it's a cool story to be able to say that you worked with, shipwrecked ale yeast or something found on a wild cacao, but have an idea of what you want the beer to taste like prior to brewing it, and try to document that, or at least have that discussion, so that once the beer is brewed, did you achieve that, right? This is a process that we're working with for any core beer, anything that we're rebrewing, right? We already have an idea of what we want that beer to taste like, and we're trying to hit that target and recreate that beer each time. So in your mind, and better on paper, try to define what you want that beer to taste like, so that you'll know if you don't hit that target, how to manipulate those ingredients or replace them in the future to hit those targets. So what do you want the yeast to contribute? Flavor contribution, obviously. Interactions with other ingredients. So do you want something that has a lower attenuation and leaves some more residual sugar? Are you going to manipulate that by your mash temperature, or by utilizing a strain that has a different attenuation range? Because not only is that going to make the beer sweeter, that's going to change your perception of malt character. It's going to change your perceived bitterness. If you have a high amount of residual sugar, it's going to be a little bit more balanced as opposed to something that's really dry. So a 40 IBU beer with 4.5 finishing gravity, compared to a 40 IBU beer and something that finished at 1.5 or 2, you're going to perceive that bitterness very differently. So there's different ways of achieving that and manipulating that, but just keep in mind that your yeast selection is one way of doing that. Are you utilizing house strains or buying a lab blended pitch? So, fortunately, buying it from a lab, it's a lot easier to get equal proportions, being that we're doing all the cell counts and hold it to a high standard. But if say you're working with a London Fog, that London 3 type strain, and you're going to work with cal ale, and you have cal ale in house, but you're going to blend the two, you're going to want to have a good idea of the health of especially what you're pulling from your harvest, and the cell concentration and count, because your volumes are probably going to be different if you're blending it yourself as opposed to lab grown yeast. Our concentrations are very similar across the board. We have very high standards for that. But when you're pulling it out of a fermenter, your slurry density is going to vary a lot, right? Based off of the beer, based off of the fermenter you're pulling it from. and a number of other factors. So just keep that in mind if you're trying to create consistency and you're working with one strain from in-house. That cell counting and then viability testing is key. And then storage and lineage considerations. So, is it a strain that you've been sitting on for a while? Has it been stored in the cone or in a brink for a little bit longer than ideal? Do you plan on reusing this blend? Because the proportions and the way that you harvest that is going to drift fairly quickly. Meaning if you have that high flocculent strain, so let's use an example of a Belgian strain that tends to not be very flocculent compared to Cal Ale that's extremely flocculent and easy to work with. You might throw that in on the first batch and have a great fermentation. But if you go to harvest that highly flocculent strain, that Cal Ale strain, is going to be really easy to work with, whereas that Belgian strain is going to still be in suspension. So considering, how you can force that yeast to flock out and try to get that equal balance as much as possible. So you're not, that 50-50 blend that you started with doesn't become 40-60 or 30-70 over your next batch, because that is going to change the flavor quite a bit. So working with these blends, you're generally not going to be able to get, 10 plus generations as you would with a single strain. And I should kind of preface that by saying you can get 10 generations, but your flavor is going to drift from that target pretty substantially in that time, as opposed to working with one strain. There's less variables, right? So while we might be able to work with a new strain to have unique flavors, there's a set of unique challenges that we need to consider, and there's costs associated with that as well. So building those costs into that brand, again, before you even brew it, so if you hit that target you're looking for. Recipe development. So choose a beer style, build a recipe, consider yeast strain, consider attenuation ABV. So, what we like to do if we're working with a new blend is remove as many variables as possible. So we go to our default ale fermentation profile. That's looking at starting at 19 for the first 3 days, and then after 19, doing a free rise to 21. And that allows to reabsorb any diacetyl precursor, as well as speed fermentation along a little bit. And then at terminal, drop the beer. So this is for a hoppy beer, looking at it. Drop the beer to 15 or 60, collect the yeast, and then dry hop. So ideally, being able to drop it cooler than that would be preferable for yeast harvest, but for hop utilization, keeping it in that warmer temperatures is beneficial. But it's kind of a balance, right? Pulling that yeast as soon as we can, as soon as we've hit terminal, without risking the integrity of the beer. So not needing any more maturation or conditioning. Being able to pull the yeast is preferential and ideal for yeast health, especially at those warmer temperatures. Storing a yeast slurry in a cone at 60 degrees in a highly alcoholic environment, you're going to see your yeast viability and vitality in sequential generations drop very, very quickly. So start with a baseline profile and ensure your yeast strain is the only variable. Again, why trying to work with a generic fermentation profile helps us establish that baseline, just according to strain performance and manufacturer's recommendations. So, if this doesn't fit within what the lab says the strain should be utilized, then just take that into consideration. And as I said, this is the profile we use. So our brewery is unique in that, it's a blessing and a curse for our team that we work with so many different yeast strains, because it's great for R&D purposes, but it's hard for consistency purposes, right? We're working with new ingredients and a new variable in almost every beer we brew. So working with these baseline fermentation profiles work great, but it might not produce the best beer with that strain. So learning how to adapt that over time, once we've seen that performance in our fermenters, in that brand, that initial beer. So determine potential attenuation. Again, a lot of these tips are good for working with a single or mixed culture, but performing a forced fermentation, I think, is great, because you'll get an idea very early on your maximum attenuation and terminal gravity. Working with 2 strains, there's a little bit more variability. So performing this test to know when the fermentation is complete is great, especially if you're looking to pull that yeast off and not leave it in the fermenter longer than necessary. So a case study of a project that we've been working on fairly recently on a hazy IPA. I've got some kinetics that I'll show, but the objective of this was to utilize a yeast strain that fits the property of it, I should say strain or strains that fit properties of hazy IPA style while lending uniqueness to differentiate our brand in the marketplace. So we used 4 different blends. And the considerations were, does this blend consist of components already on hand? Are we going to be able to map generations and use this in sequential fermentations, or is it a one and done pitch? Does this blend stand out from others or common yeast strains? So we utilized 4 blends, and you can see some differences just in the kinetics here, right? So they all hit terminal gravity. They were a little on the slower side. It might have been some hop creep is what was going on looking at it. But, essentially they hit terminal gravity day 6 or 7, depending on it. Some of them a little bit slower, looking at closer to day 9. And those are things to consider too, right? Flavor being first and foremost, but the performance in taking that into consideration and in establishing these charts too. So if we like how the beer turned out, we know what the profile and the gravity drop should look like to recreate it. Being that we were working with strains that were all that fairly fit the style, attenuation was on the higher end for the brand that we were actually brewing, but they were all pretty consistent, right? So all the blends performed fairly consistently, except for this blend 2 that gravity dropped fairly quick, and it finished out a little bit quicker than the other ones. But there wasn't a whole lot of difference in attenuation and then in return residual sugar. Looking at pH, again, fairly consistent, but this blend 2 is still kind of the oddball, right? So this one finishing at 4.4, whereas blend 3 and 4 finishing at 4.6. So that's also going to affect flavor perception, right? So if you have more acidity, it's gonna change the way that you perceive hop compounds, bitterness, and drinkability of the beer too. So these are all aspects you should be looking at to correlate sensory data and to reinforce what your panel's picking up. Looking at some of the flavor compounds, and I'll get to some of the sensory stuff after this. They were all fairly similar, but some of the differences that we saw was blend 4. So you got 5 blends on this one, so I apologize for the confusion on that. But blend 4, looking at this green one here, we had isoamyl acetate, looking at just about 1 ppm, which is over threshold, right? So that's something that we might flag and look at the sensory data and say, did anybody actually pick that up? But we also have in blend 4, your amyl alcohols are on the higher end. And this is looking like it's probably 60, 70 ppm. So that's, something that you might be able to taste, and it might come out as hot or harsh for some of those fusel alcohols. And then looking at sensory trials, so perform a blind sensory panel with samples. We utilize hedonic and descriptive when it's something that when it's not an established brand. The descriptive test is to document appearance, aroma, flavor, and mouthfeel of each sample. So while these won't be a direct correlation on how the yeast strain impacted it, it could be other process or ingredient contributions, it does give us a good baseline, and then we can compare the blends and the resulting beers next to each other. Hedonic tests, so just rating the quality of the sample on a 9-point scale. I think, honestly, this is one of the most beneficial tests because it's how much do you like the beer? If you get an overwhelmingly a lot of positive feedback from one sample over another's, well, that's probably something to explore. And then you can go back and look at all the data that I provided in the previous slides and say, okay, does this correlate with anything? Does this beer stand out with any of these other tests that we performed, because everybody really likes this sample. Let's try to dive in and find out why. So hedonic and descriptive tests for these 4 blends, we looked at the mean, pretty standard across the board here. This blend 1, stood out a little bit. We do look at standard deviation too, and take into account panel size. If you have, 5 people on your panel and 4 rated a 5, and then 1 person rates it a 9, it's going to skew that. So looking at the data set in its entirety, but you can see there were flavor descriptor differences, even though it was the same wort, the same mash, same water bill or water profile, and then generally the same fermentation conditions, they did come out different. So blend 1, grapefruit, orange, peach. Blend 2, orange, cantaloupe, red, apple. But being the same hop bill, there were a lot of similar characteristics, right? And being all strains that were to style and appropriate of that style, it's not unsurprising that some of the descriptors were a little bit on the similar side. But being able to identify that last 10% of what differentiates this blend or this strain compared to others is very beneficial, because there's a lot of good beer out there on the market. And if you could differentiate your beer being 10% better than somebody else's, that's a pretty substantial improvement to your product. Harvesting difficulties, I know I touched on this a little bit, but population shift over time, meaning, you have your low flocculent strain up here and your high flocculent strain might be here. Just looking at your harvesting practices and adapting them where necessary. Maybe you need to do multiple trube dumps. Maybe you need to harvest at a different time than you're used to allow both of those strains to try to evenly flock out as much as possible. And then competition. So if one of the strains has more dramatic growth phase, and you end up with more of that strain in your slurry than the other, that's just going to naturally happen over time too. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to look under a microscope and differentiate 2 strains of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. If you really know the culture, you might be able to get an idea, but I don't suggest it. And then different organisms will prefer different temperatures and environments, or different environments, temperatures, substrate, so sugar profile, and then oxygen as well. I think I would really look at oxygen and temperature as the 2 most impactful, aside from harvesting, if you're going to look at reharvesting. And then consideration for wild yeast and bacteria. Fermentation timelines varied from brewer's yeast, so it's a lot slower, right? Especially those naturally, like when you're working with introducing lactic acid bacteria as a secondary fermentation, the timeline is a lot slower, and it's because it's a lot slower, it's a lot more difficult to manipulate and recreate. So in conclusion, look at performance. So consider repeatability, speed, reliability when selecting strains. And then I can't stress this enough, but what does the culture add to the beer? Do you like it, or do your consumers like it? I think it's something that's not spoken about enough in our industry, and it's a little bit taboo, right? We all want to produce the beer that we want, but I think it's okay to meet our customers in the middle. Can we produce a beer that we're happy with, that they really enjoy as well? Everybody's had a Rauch beer that's been on tap for 6 months, and there's like the 3 of us that love it and nobody wants to buy it. So just things to consider and experiment. Cool. I've got a couple minutes for questions now. If anybody wants to take down my address, or anybody watching this on YouTube later, feel free to shoot me an email. I love talking about this stuff. I've been bummed to have to resort to doing it on Zoom for the last year. So I can't wait to start doing it in person a little bit more, hopefully this year. I got my first vaccine shot this week, so looking up.
That's awesome. Thank you, Erik, for all the great information and the presentation. Is there anyone here that has a question? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Does anybody brew? Oh, go ahead.
I think you kind of covered it, and I certainly think if I look back through the notes or through the presentation, I'll get the answer. But explicitly, like, what would you say are the primary factors or considerations between co-pitching versus using one yeast first and then following up with another? I mean, I think some of the obvious ones you did point out, like, maybe you're using one yeast to just drive attenuate flavor, and then the other yeast to like take care of attenuation or whatever.
Mhm.
But I guess only through experimentation can you figure out what kind of flavor masking or flavor amplification are you going to get when you co-pitch that you would avoid by like a staggered pitch.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that, right? So when you're co-pitching at the onset of fermentation, you're looking at coaxing flavor from both the strains. If you're looking at a staggered fermentation, and let's just talk sack strains here, you're looking to get some of the kinetics, like some of the attributes outside of flavor production, because that first 48 hours is really your Goldilocks zone for flavor production. So if you're utilizing anything outside of that, you're just looking at primarily attenuation, right? Or maybe alcohol tolerance even is something that I didn't really touch on. But if you're pitching both the strains directly into your wort, you're looking at flavor from both those strains. If you're going to stagger it, then you're looking at some of the other attributes that aren't so influenced by flavor. Now, if you're talking about Brett or something, it just like that's kind of where this talk where I got hung up a little bit is like that's a whole nother rabbit hole because you are talking about flavor and secondary fermentation there, but it's a completely different organism, so it gets a little trickier. And Tony said that their Rausch beer sold well, so I'm jealous. I don't know where that is, but I want to go.
Any other questions?
Cool.
Wow. Yeah, you gave us so much information, Erik. You must have done a really good job.
It was super informative, honestly.
Cool.
I have a lot to digest, which is sort of a bad pun, I guess.
No, I appreciate the engagement and everybody taking time out of their day, because you all have been putting on a lot of content, and I've been getting the recap emails every day. And we like to work with state guilds obviously a lot, and more localized guilds, because there's such a community, and it's interesting to see, and being able to travel around and work with so many different people, the community and like the structure of some guilds are awesome, and other areas are just kind of not super cohesive. So the fact that you all had the ability to have, I don't know how many, is this day 10 or something, of like 4 or 5 talks a day is just insane. So it's awesome.
Well, thanks, Erik. It's a great
a marathon, not a sprint, as they say. Oh wait, not what they say. What do they say? I don't know. Can I ask a question that's not really about the yeast per se?
What's that?
What are the differences between your 3 facilities? Is there something that you're doing in Denmark that you're not doing in California, or vice versa?
Yes and no. So all the yeast coming out of Copenhagen is certified organic. And that's the nature of the European market. And we have, as of this week, imported some of that yeast into the US, which is kind of funny you think about us importing or exporting to other countries as opposed to the other way around. But, they're just being a little bit more demand, and their production being a little bit smaller of a scale. We've seen the drive for organic yeast is a little niche, so not everybody wants it, and producing everything organic raises the cost quite a bit, and separating that is very difficult from a normal production facility, just having a couple strains that are organic and a couple that aren't, because the substrate that we're using is like, we do have a 24 hectoliter 4-vessel brew house here that uses, like, so a lot of the beers that I was discussing was brewed on that system for our tasting rooms, but we're mostly doing wort production 7 days a week, and we're using that growth medium for all of our strains. So in Copenhagen, we're able to do organic to kind of fit that need, and now carry some of that, which is super cool. In regards to Asheville and San Diego, there's not really a difference. We're utilizing San Diego to still produce homebrew. Homebrew pitches are still really important to our company, and just some of the materials and equipment that's needed for that's a little bit different. So trying to, COVID's been a good test for having multiple production facilities, because if anything ever goes down, you still have backup, right? So we've been able to keep fairly good stock levels throughout this whole crisis. With demand has just been all over the place, as we all know. Like, and there's a lead time, just like beer. Like, it takes us 3 weeks. So if we don't have something today and it's not currently being propagated, there's 3 weeks till they get it. So being able to have multiple sites running at different capacities has been pretty awesome. Because running out of yeast sucks as much as running out of beer.
Yeah, no doubt. What is it that is inorganic about the way yeast is normally produced?
Just the malt that's used is certified organic.
That's it. Okay.
Yeah. So, and organic malt's just more expensive. And if most people aren't asking for it, we don't want to raise the cost of everybody's yeast just because there's a couple people. So finding another facility that we have that can meet that need is pretty great. The European market's definitely different than the domestic market too.
We actually have a couple of questions coming in too.
Cool.
We have A.O. DeGard raising their hand, and then we've got one from David we'll get to.
Cool.
It's a sidebar kind of a thing. A few years ago, Chris White, John Palmer, and John Blinkman did a thing on pressurized fermentation, and it was really intriguing and opened up a lot of eyes. This was basically using lager, but there was some discussion of, well, maybe we want to do some more experiments on this with some ale yeast or Belgian yeast and see what develops. Is there any plans or ongoing experiments down that path?
Not specifically. I would be interested with ale strains too. So the benefit, and to recap that for anybody that hasn't heard that podcast or read the articles on it, is performing pressurized fermentations about 1 bar on lager strains allowed them to ferment at closer to ale temperatures in a much shorter period of time. So, generally, again, I said earlier in the talk, warmer temperatures equals more flavor, but then there's impact like pressure. And applying 1 bar allowed us to warm those lager strains up so they fermented more quickly, but decreased metabolite production, so they didn't put as much flavor. Normally, using a lager strain at 65 degrees Fahrenheit is going to be kind of gross, right? You're probably going to get a lot of sulfur and other undesirable compounds, but applying that pressure helped mitigate that aspect of their metabolite production. So to answer your question, no, we don't have anything currently in the works. It would be interested looking at ale temperatures to say, I think Kveik's opened everybody up to fermenting at much warmer temperatures, but if we could ferment even warmer and have a quicker fermentation with other strains, but still remain clean, that would be pretty cool. But no, I don't know the answer to that, and there's nothing currently on the docket for it.
All right, thank you.
And we have a question from David Wolliver. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, you guys house custom strains, so somebody has a strain running and then they kind of keep it at your facility or whatever. Do you notice that there is a house profile? Like if they had 001 or 029 and they had it in their house for a while, they liked what it was doing, they sent it. Do you notice any flavor differences, or is more of it just acclimation to, what do you notice with those strains?
So what you're saying is if you buy a culture from us and you're on Gen 20 and you've seen some drift and you like the way it's performing, can you then bank that with us and try to recreate that? Is that what you're asking?
For those that do, is it significant? Is that house flavor, what people talk about, is that significant that you find, or not really?
I don't know the answer to the question, but I would highly suspect that it probably isn't genetic drift, which would drastically change it. I bet it's more just how that strain's adapted to your conditions you're using it in, your brew house. So if you were to use that strain somewhere else, and we all see it, right? When you use a strain in a 90 barrel fermenter compared to like a 15 or 30, like it just starts behaving differently. And sometimes flavor is a little wonky and timeline gets a little different based on tank geometry. You could bank it, but I think you would still see a flavor drift over time. And it's not uncommon to hear people say they like when it gets to like Gen 10 as being like, performing the best and most consistent and really liking the flavors it's producing. But there's not a whole lot of people that will take that Gen 10 and then bank it and then propagate it each time. If you wanted to, it's not that expensive. I think the initial setup fee, I'm not the best one to talk about pricing, but it's, I think, around $500. And then the lead time is where it kind of starts screwing with people because we're propagating that custom each time at that point.
Right.
And if
Okay,
it's,
thank you.
like, coal shale yeast or something, it's like you could buy it or you can, but genetically, you're not going to see a lot of drift over that time. It's fairly stable, and you can see some petite mutants form over time, but it's usually going to be a negative more than a positive. It's very rare you're going to see genetic drift, and it's something that's like awesome. It's usually like, oh, it won't flocculate, or it's stalling out, or just taking a dump on me.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, guys? And I just want to say, Erik, earlier you had mentioned how great it was. Our community had 10 days of 40 plus sessions, and wanted to thank you and all the allied members and everyone who presented, because it wouldn't be possible without all of your support and all the great information you provided us with. So thanks again.
Yeah, I love doing it. And it's so easy from just doing it from the office or home or wherever now.
Right?
I would have loved to fly to New York though. Yeah.
I know. Hopefully, next year it's on the calendars for in person. So we look forward to that. And also, I just want to mention to everyone, White Labs has a profile on the New York State CBC website. I put a link to it in the chat. So there's a lot of great information and resources on White Labs there as well. And Erik's email lives there if you end up losing it after this. So
yeah, and like to self-promote a little bit, we've got a lot of educational content, like banked seminars on our YouTube channel too. So if anybody's looking for other additional content on fermentation, we were at a point where we were doing one a week during the beginning of the pandemic. So there's just so much content out there and I know all these are banked too. So, spread the word and throw it on like a podcast when you're driving to work or whatever.
That's great. Thank you.
And don't worry, I'll bring Erik to New York at some point.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, guys.
Of course. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, then we hope to see you all at our next session at 4 o'clock. That is the New York Hop. Let me just make sure I get the name right here. New York. Oop, I lost the page.
Brewing with New York State hops.
Thanks. Wow, that was a really hard one to remember. Brewing with New York State hops. And then also we have our happy hour, the last happy hour at 5:30 p.m. today. We've got a live performance of Simmel, so we hope you all join us for that as well.
Thanks, you guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.